I'm in the Arabian desert, home to one of the great pilgrimages in the world, where for thousands of years, people have come to answer the call of Abraham and celebrate the worship of one God. Coming to Mecca on the Hajj is a duty and privilege for all Muslims.
I don't want to get distracted by the crowds.
I truly was alone with God in a sea of 5 million people.
For outsiders, rare access to an arduous and emotional journey.
It was a test. Do you trust God more than anything else?
But can these American pilgrims find what they're looking for?
Hello and welcome to Meet Us on the Abraham Path. I'm Anisa Mehdi, Executive Director of the Abraham Path Initiative.
Today we are joined by the best-selling writer Bruce Feiler and the charismatic Imam, Johari Abdul Malik. We'll be talking together about Abraham and the Hajj Pilgrimage. The pilgrimage began this year on July 28th on the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula in the storied city of Mecca. It is at Mecca, according to the Quran, that Abraham and his son Ishmael raised the foundations of the Kaaba. The Kaaba is revered by Muslims as the house of the one God. They face toward it in prayer and circle around it during pilgrimage.
If you're not familiar with that story about Abraham, you're not alone. To shed some light, let's welcome Bruce Feiler, best-selling author and commentator on contemporary culture. Bruce, it is so good to see you again.
Nice to be with you. Thank you for doing this. What a important moments in time, and what a great day that we're here to talk about.
Thanks. And for you, such an important moment in time, your brand new book, Life is in the Transition. How's that going?
It's going amazing. It's been a remarkable few weeks. Released the book. I was on Today Show and Good Morning America and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And it's interesting, Arianna Huffington wrote a piece this weekend that connected my work on life transitions and how we manage difficult times in our lives with my work on pilgrimages, because the themes are very similar, that we go through periods of growth and renewal that often have difficult parts of them in our lives. And of course, nothing captures this more than the great pilgrimage traditions of the Abrahamic faiths.
Well, let's talk about that just for a moment. You and I first worked together in 2013 and 14 on a series called Sacred Journeys with Bruce Feiler, a PBS series. And I directed the episode on the Hajj Pilgrimage with you. And that's a big life transition for people.
Well, I think that, it's funny if we start with the religious traditions and work towards today. I mean, if all of the Abrahamic traditions have an idea that not only does life begin in chaos, right, and that God creates order out of chaos. That's the opening sentence of the Hebrew Bible, and that theme continues in the New Testament and also in the Quran. But all of these scriptural traditions and Abrahamic faiths in particular say that we go back to those periods of chaos, right? All three Abrahamic faiths have an idea that there are key moments in the story where we leave the civilized world, go off into the wilderness. Obviously, Abraham does that when he leaves his native land in the biblical account and goes down to the promised land. The Israelites leaving, going into the desert, the Jerusalemites leaving and going by the rivers of Babylon. Jesus goes out into the desert. Of course, Muhammad goes out into the desert. And in the Quranic account, Abraham goes out into the deserts of Saudi Arabia to visit Ishmael, who's also in the wilderness. So there is, and what's interesting in the scriptural tradition is these are the periods when there's the greatest breakthroughs in theology and closeness to God and in understanding yourself. And in a lot of ways, my new book, Life is in the Transitions, is about that happens to us when we have a diagnosis, a downsizing, or tornado, a pandemic, we lose jobs, we lose children, we become empty nesters. These are all periods that we go through similar periods of transition, which involve difficult periods in the wilderness, but can also, as in the scriptural accounts, be periods of renewal and growth.
And a lot of those come in this, there are 6 different pilgrimages that we are looking at in this series. So I highly recommend Sacred Journeys with Bruce Feiler. So let's bring in Imam Johari Abdul Malik, who is joining us as well. Imam Johari was part of the film that Bruce starred in and that I've directed for him. It's great to see you, Imam. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Great to be with you, especially in this season of pilgrimage.
What does that bring to you? You've been to Mecca many times and you've led pilgrims through the Hajj. What are you feeling right now?
You know, every year around this time, and I'm not alone, and I'm sure Bruce feels this too. That when the time of pilgrimage comes, maybe it's not your pilgrimage, maybe it's the pilgrimage of a different tradition. But as you begin to get that feeling that wow, something on our planet is happening, people are moving and migrating out of a call that God is asking them to take this journey. And so for me, this time of year, every day, especially, we chart the months by the moon. So as I see the new moon of the month of Hajj, as the moon becomes larger and larger, I know that people are gathering and the crowds are becoming larger and larger in Mecca. And I start feeling homesick, that I wish I was in that crowd. Maybe not this crowd, but that spiritual crowd that happens in this annual migration of, you know, maybe 4, 5, 6 million people is the tradition, who all are gathering for one purpose, just to have that experience, to be alone with God and a crowd of millions of people.
I want to mention that Johari is the former director of outreach at the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Virginia. He was the first Muslim chaplain at Howard University and is a founding member of the Muslim Alliance in North America. And interestingly, and particularly regarding today, and I hope we get to this later in the show, you're on the board of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative.
Indeed.
Muslim ARC.
Yep.
And you'll find links to those to that in your in the chat section, members of the audience. We want to welcome you also, all of the folks who out there who have come to join us. We'll be communicating with you through chat, and we want you to communicate with us through the questions. We want you to ask questions of our guests as we go through our program. So you're both experts on pilgrimage. Bruce, you've written about Abraham and walking the Bible, and Johari, you've been on Hajj, at least 5 times. What is the ultimate goal of making a pilgrimage? Him? Bruce, you go first.
Okay, so I, you know, I've come up with a new way of thinking about this, actually, even since in Sacred Journeys, and I will say, for you were kind enough to talk about this series that I did, in which in the course of 1 year, I went on pilgrimages in Japan, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, India, and Nigeria. Now, it's possible somebody else did all of these over time. I don't think it's literally mathematically possible until the age of the jet airplane, you know, so maybe Burton would have done it, but I'm not sure he made it to Japan. So I did have this unusual experience, and I thought a lot about it in those years, but I want to use an analogy that I've never used before, and because it's on my mind, because it's in my book on life is in the transitions, and it has to be that we have these building blocks that give us meaning in our lives. Okay, and I call them the ABCs of meaning. One of them is, the A is agency. That's things that we do, we make, that's our career, like the part of us where we are in control of our lives, right? And then the B is our belonging, our relationships, our connections, our neighbors, our communities. And the C is a cause, that's something higher than ourselves, a higher purpose. And so the way I think about this is that I think of it as Lady Justice, with not 2 scales, but 3. And that what happens in times of our lives is that one of the scales gets overweighted, like we're working too hard, right? Or maybe we're a parent and we're giving too much to our children and we don't have time to give back. Or maybe we're a caretaker or a first responder now and we're burned out and we need to do something for ourselves. But what happens in our lives, and I was thinking about this when Johari was speaking about this time of year, because annually, and frankly, more often, once or twice or 3 or 6 or however many times a year, our balance in our lives gets off. And I think that a lot of what pilgrimage is there for, and the reason that the idea of pilgrimages has survived for 3 millennia, there's not that many aspects of religion in the ancient world that are continue until today. But pilgrimage is one of them, because it's a way to rebalance and recalibrate kind of the weight and the priority that we give things in our lives. And the primary way that pilgrimage does that is by calling us to leave the normal. Like, so what is pilgrimage? It's a breach in the normal. And we have to leave our normal lives and go into sacred time and sacred space, which allows us to think and reflect and then rebalance what's most important in our lives.
There's a, go ahead, Johari. There's a piece that you say later in a clip we're going to see that validates here. Go ahead.
When I think about the pilgrimage to Mecca, the biggest one for me, and similar to what Bruce is sharing, that this is a space where you get out of your comfort zone. And getting out of your comfort zone, you begin to have that away experience, to be able to reflect on who are you, what are you, why are you, and it is rare. I think the COVID lockdown experience for many people, and Bruce, you're probably gonna write a book about this. You can always send me a small check when after get the signing thing. That the COVID experience for many people is that seclusion.
Yeah, totally.
Of a Moses, of a Muhammad alayhi salam, of a Jesus in the desert, and people are going through that process, even though they're never leaving their homes.
Yes.
But that is, for most of us, we never get a chance to do that. We have to actually leave our place, and the call to Mecca is a once in a lifetime opportunity for that global transformation. We're experiencing that now for the first time, probably since the Spanish plague, a global migration away from our everyday lives, our clothes, our work, or whatever. But now, can we take that time to do the internal work? When you're on a structured pilgrimage, whether you feel like doing that spiritual work or not, some of it's gonna happen to you, because you are forced as being part of something way larger than yourself. And so the Quran says, to Abraham, proclaim Hajj among all of humankind. And so for me, and I'm a heretic in this regard, I believe that because Allah says in the Quran to Abraham, and it is dictated to us over the last 14 centuries, that Hajj is a pilgrimage that is an obligation on humankind, not just people who say, I believe in Muhammad, not just people who say, I follow Moses or Jesus, that this pilgrimage to this sacred place is something that is a transformative moment that everyone needs.
And it's coming from that declaration from Ibrahim.
Yes.
To come. So let's talk a bit about.
Not Muhammad saying, I'm telling you to come.
It's Ibrahim, who is the root of other 3 main familiar religious traditions, right? I remember when I was editing the National Geographic film on Hajj that I did called Inside Mecca, and we'll see a clip from that a bit later. We were in Washington, D.C., and one of my executive producers came by, and we were talking about Abraham's role in the pilgrimage, and he walked by the room, and then he walked backwards to do a second double take, and he said, Abraham? You mean my Abraham? Had no idea that there was this deep connection. And a lot of people don't. So Abraham made the call, like God's instruction, bring the people here to pray. But so what is his role in the Hajj?
Well, I think that, I'll jump in there, because I want to build on something that Johari just said, and I'll come back to that. But why Abraham, right? Why is it that Abraham is the shared ancestor of Jews and Christians and Muslims? And in fact, I don't know how much you can see of me, but that over there is a picture of Abraham on the cover of Time magazine in 2002 on the 1-year anniversary of 9/11, which is an excerpt from the book I wrote about Abraham. And Abraham, one of the reasons I think that Abraham plays this shared role is that he is before the iconic figure and dominant figure in each of the traditions that grew out of him, right? So that, Abraham is chronologically before Moses, right? So he's the first of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's son Joseph goes into slavery for 438 years, and then Moses leads them out. So you've gone back almost 1,000 years before Moses to get to Abraham. And then by the time you get to Christianity wanted to link itself to the Abrahamic traditions, but had a certain amount of problems with the Mosaic law. So going back behind Moses was a helpful connection. And then along comes Islam, chronologically 600 years after Christianity, and they want to link themselves, but they got problems with Jesus and they got problems with Moses. So going back to Abraham has a tactical advantage. But to build on what Johari said, and in fact, in the Genesis account of Abraham, it literally is a lech lecha, go forth. So he goes forth on this pilgrimage called by God. You're talking about something that would have been 2,000 years before, chronologically at least, the Hajj would have begun. He goes on this journey into the unknown that's very similar to what happens later. This is long before Ishmael and long before Isaac. But to build on what the connection I think you made intriguingly, Johari, to COVID is, let's remember Jews were ghettoized for 1,500 years after the rise of Christianity. So there was no going forth on physical pilgrimages. So the rabbis kind of reinterpreted lech lecha, go forth, to be less of a physical journey and more of an internal journey, because it's something that you could do in quarantine or in ghetto. And here we are today having to reimagine what pilgrimage means.
Right. Well, here we are, somewhat ghettoized. The Saudi government, in this case, it is the Saudi government, has put a ban on, I would say wisely, preventing internationals from participating in the Hajj this year. Only people who live on the peninsula itself are permitted to go. What's that going to mean for pilgrims, though? If you had that call and you heard it and you wanted to be there, what's the story there? What does that do?
I think that it takes us perhaps back in Ramadan. I had to share with people because they were saying, we can't get together, and so much of religious community is about that common unity, about us being together. And I said, but remember, when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the angel Gabriel, the angel that has come to all of the previous prophets, met him in a cave when he was in seclusion. The revelation began in seclusion. It began away from society. And so perhaps your experience in seclusion is more akin to that spiritual connection that the prophet had that started the work of his dispensation. But people people are going to miss. They're going to not be able to take part in this, and that's why I think today so much of the virtual work. I think it was a brilliant compromise of the Saudi government to say, let locals come and we'll do social distancing and we'll do all that. So now with the advent of cameras and so on, people can see the Hajj is being done, the tradition is being maintained, and can feel a connection that those people are carrying our prayers to Arafat. They're not just praying for themselves. In the Quran, the opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says, Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim. And I remind people, it doesn't say, Ihdini Sirat al-Mustaqim. Oh, show me the path. It says, Ihdina, show us the path, God, that you want us to follow. And so those pilgrims who are there, they're our proxy. And so people can still have that feeling. We haven't abandoned this tradition of the journey. We just have other people in proxy for us who are walking in those footsteps of Abraham and Muhammad.
Well, let's take a look at what it is that some people are missing. From a clip from my Inside Mecca, the big day is the day of Arafat, which is a practice for the day of judgment, people like to say. And it's a time for seeking absolution and forgiveness. You will hear the voice of the narrator of the National Geographic documentary, Keith David, and meet the three people that I featured in that film.
A strange quiet descends in the afternoon as people turn inward. It's called the Standing at Arafat. In this realm of forgiveness, Khalil finds a semblance of the equality he seeks.
It can remind you the day of judgment when God is going to gather all the nation together, no discrimination. If you look left and right, you found the women, men are standing up, crying to God to show that all of us, we are one in front of God.
Ismail, who has all he needs in the material world, tackles a poverty of spirit.
Most of our dua or prayers to God will be heard and hopefully, will be granted by Him. It all depends on how strong is your asking from Him and how real is it, or is it just hypocritical, things like that. So how sincere are you, when you ask for forgiveness from Him and ask for some good tidings from Him.
Surrounded by millions, Ismail finds himself utterly alone before God, pleading for relief from an unspoken burden on his soul.
Just now I felt very lonely. Just me and God. And I got emotional about it. You are actually communicating with God. Okay. At that moment of time. So it's only God knows what is in my heart. So at that moment of time, I'm alone.
God to have mercy on my father who passed away, and to ease my mother's life because she has Alzheimer's, and from the outside in her life looks very hard.
Thank you, God, for responding when I was looking for you. Thank you for coming to find me. Please, God, hold on to me.
You can't just sort of live life, confess and be forgiven, and then go back and live life. The real point is that you improve yourself.
One of the questions that's come in from our audience is, what was a heart-moving moment for you on pilgrimage? And to me, that particular excerpt shows heart-moving moment for people. What about you, Imam?
I hope I'm not getting too ahead of ourselves, but I grew up, I came to some level of consciousness, born in 1956, so in the late 60s in New York City. I encountered, between that and visiting my relatives in the South, a significant amount of racism. While I was on the pilgrimage to Mecca, seeing people from all different parts of the world, facial features, complexions, hair, structures that I couldn't associate with any particular people, languages that I didn't speak. And as part of the Hajj pilgrimage, you perform a set of 7 circumambulations around the Kaaba. And it had to have been a day that was at least 100 degrees outside. And even with all of the great work that the Saudi government has done to air condition and do whatever, you're outside, and it's fans not going to save you. And I looked over and I saw a man and his wife and 2 children. And the father was there with his wife. There was an older child who was walking, and he was carrying a child that was old enough to walk, but clearly in the crowd of thousands of people, wouldn't be safe for them to walk. And he's walking and he's carrying her and he's sweating. And you know, Anisa, I was not only strong back then, but I was also young. But I also realized that I'm Black. And he doesn't know me, but I see he's struggling, and I could help him. I could carry his child for him, give him a break. But then I have this other thought in my mind saying, you know, I'm on a spiritual high. I'm in love with just all of humanity coming together. If I look at him and say, I don't speak your language, but I'll carry your child for you, he might reject me. He might not say the N-word, but I didn't want, I'm like, do I want to open myself up to that? Is that my own like baggage I'm bringing with me? Is this a transformative place? But if we get separated, he doesn't know me. I don't have his phone number. We're not. If I have malfeasance in my heart, I could just take his child. He'd never find him. This is a leap of faith. And so I look at him and smile. I guess maybe the smile helped a little bit. And I made the gesture, I'll carry your child. He looked at his wife, who looked at him like, you're pathetic. You're not going to be able to make it, baby, right? And she said, I think we can trust him. And he looked at me like, okay. And I put my arm in his arm, and he passed me his child, and we circumambulated the Kaaba together. And I'm like, wow, as a person with my own background and my own baggage, for that moment to transcend racism, that was powerful for me. I'll never forget that.
Bet it stays close with you these days, Imam, when things are just so tense and mean right now in our country.
And that's why I'm involved in this work with the Muslim not just, I'm not racist, I'm anti-racist collaborative, because we need to extend it beyond the 5 days of Hajj. And how do we do that?
How do we do that? Good question. Well, it being a moment of great transition, perhaps Bruce has some thoughts on how to extend that. How would you apply the wisdom of your book to Abraham, for one, but also to the people who are involved in making this Hajj, whether they're present there or making it in that precious sacred seclusion? Please unmute yourself.
Sorry, first of all, that was a pleasure, Johari. That was profound and real and meaningful for all of us to listen. So thank you for sharing that. You know, to pick up on your question, Anisa, when I was watching that clip, and let's just pause a minute and acknowledge that it was well directed, and it was well directed, I think, because you could get the scope of it, of this experience, but also the intimacy of it, and that's really the point that I wanted to make. So just to take a quick detour into transitions to work my way back toward your question, The work I've just done on transitions and the story that I tell in my book is that out of some personal crises that I went through, cancer, near bankruptcy, and a series of suicide attempts by my father who has Parkinson's, I went out and I crisscrossed the country and interviewed hundreds of Americans of all ages and all walks of life, all 50 states, who went through wrenching life changes. And I ended up with 6,000 pages of transcripts, 1,000 hours of interviews, and I spent a year with 12 people combing through them, looking for themes and patterns that could help all of us in times of difficulty. And the particular point I want to make now is that, you know, we have lots of disruptors in our lives, and then 3 to 5 times in our lives we have what I call a lifequake, which is a massive change that is higher on the Richter scale of consequences and has aftershocks that last for years. And I analyze these lifequakes in terms of 2 metrics. Are they voluntary or involuntary? 47% were voluntary. People chose to make changes. They got sober, left a bad marriage, started a new venture. 53% were involuntary. You got a diagnosis, you lost your job, you know, your spouse cheated on you. And then I did personal and collective. Okay, was this something involving you or a lot of people? So the smallest category was a personal involuntary lifequake. A personal involuntary lifequake is 9/11, is a tornado, is a recession. And there's a line in my book where I say, had I done this a century ago when we had 2 world wars and depressions, we went through more of these. What's happening right now is that the entire planet is going through a collective involuntary lifequake in the pandemic. And what tends to happen in these lifequakes is they tend to clump, right? Just when you lose your job, you get into an accident, right? Just when you're going to move, you know, your mother-in-law needs cataract surgery and your daughter has an anxiety disorder. They clump. I call this a pileup, and they're connected because what happens is our immune system is weakened, and then what could be a small change becomes a big one. That leads to the Black Lives Matter thing, because what that is a collective voluntary lifequake. We are choosing finally to address this moment, and to me, it's connected to the involuntary collective lifequake. Now, I say all of that.
Bruce, before you leave that, I think this is insightful, because I actually think that the world's response to the killing of George Floyd is directly related to that confluence.
Absolutely.
If we weren't all forced into a state where we can't breathe, we can't we can't do whatever, then that 8 minute and 45 seconds of a Black man laying on the ground who can't breathe, and that the system is stopping his mobility, those 2 things put together is what has created the response to Black Lives Matter. There's so many other people who have been killed by excessive force, yes. Black or white, yes. that the issue is it's not about police brutality. It's really part of this bigger thing that you're talking about.
And I have a piece in Time Magazine this weekend about this that brings it back to Abraham, which is where you want to be, Anisa. And I'll say this. So even though we are in a collective involuntary lifequake of the pandemic and the collective voluntary one, you know, of the reckoning of racial injustice in this country in particular, it's deceptive, because we're all going through the collective lifequake together, but the actual individual transition that each of us has to go through is unique to us. So one person may choose to respond to this by getting sober. Somebody else might choose to respond by moving. Somebody else might choose to respond by changing jobs or saying, I want to deepen my relationship with my spouse or my 20-something child who's moved back home. And what we saw in that clip, and I think that we don't talk about this enough, and this is why kind of my new work is it kind of enhanced how I see the pilgrimage. It is a collective experience, right? Some years, as Johari mentioned, 2, 3, 4 million people can go on this pilgrimage, and yet each person is experiencing it differently. And that's what your clip just showed. This one woman is talking about Alzheimer's. This other person is maybe talking about the death of a parent. Another person may think, oh my God, I've let my life get, I spend too much time staring into a screen and ignoring my children, and I want to deepen my role as a parent or a grandparent. So it is both the Hajj, all pilgrimages are collective experiences, but also individual ones.
Right, that's right. I want to bring us to a story of Abraham that we haven't discussed yet. The Abraham Path Initiative really relies on his ethical legacy, that legacy of hospitality and kindness to strangers. But when we mention Abraham out there in the world, sometimes we get the, didn't he try to kill his son question. And the telling of that story is different in the Jewish and Islamic traditions. So I'd like to hear you guys sort of share the telling of the story of the near sacrifice. And then we'll take a look at a clip from Sacred Journeys that shows the activity that the pilgrims participate in that is unique to the Islamic telling.
I think we need Bruce to lay the frame, and then I can share what I think is the moral of the story that I draw from the Islamic perspective.
So I will preface this by giving my one iron rule of interfaith conversations, which I learned the hard way after publishing a book on walking the Bible that sent me into half the churches and synagogues in America, and then had me publish 6 months, a year and a half later, a book on Abraham as the shared ancestor of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And suddenly I was in interfaith conversations, because I do think that 9/11, a good example of a horrible event that had a positive outcome of bringing, you know, certainly the American Muslim voice into the conversation of what had been a Judeo-Christian conversation. 9/11 was the beginning of the Abrahamic conversation in this country. So let's tip of a hat to a positive outcome from a horrific world event. But the iron rule is don't speak in first person plural, speak in first person singular. So
right.
I am here not speaking as a representative of the Jewish tradition, because if anybody has spent more than 3 seconds around any Jew, you know that you mentioned, Johari, before we came on the air here, that, you know, 2 rabbis, 5 opinions. How about, you know, 1 Jew, 4 opinions? Like, Jews don't even agree with themselves. So there's no such thing as a Jewish interpretation of this. But I will say, yes, this story appears first in Genesis, where the text, I used to be able to recall it so much more quickly than I'm going to do. God says, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love. And Jews have always heard that is, take Isaac and go on a pilgrimage. They march north, actually, from Beersheba, where they are, you know, toward Jerusalem in the kind of Zionist tradition of where they go, and they're carrying, and God says, you know, asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, and just as Abraham raises his hand, God says, well, now I know that you would be willing to do it, and a ram is found in, and he sacrifices a ram instead. Now, what's interesting about that is, you know, this story, back to your point, Anisa, is read in the holiest week of the Jewish year, right? Because this is read on Rosh Hashanah. It's read in the holiest week of the Christian year, because of the way Christians related to the story of Jesus, and it's read in the holiest week of the Muslim year. Like, that on the surface appears to make no sense. And so why is that? Is it because of devotion? Is it because of, you know, being willing to sacrifice your son? Is it, as some people suggest, because there was a tradition of child sacrifice, and the biblical story is attempting to show a turning of the page of a value of an ethical tradition, and human life has meaning? Everybody has a different interpretation, but I'm going to twist it before I hand it off to Johari.
Come on.
I read that passage of Abraham going forth and the sacrifice in my bar mitzvah in 1977. And my daughters read it in their, I have identical twin daughters, as you both know. They read it in their Benot mitzvah a year and a half ago. And I have to say, you know, we normally think of this, you know, Abraham going forth as the son, leaving the father, you know, the story of Isaac, you know, the son. But I have to say, I stood up that morning that my children had their double bar mitzvah and read this portion and said, wait a minute, I'm thinking about this from the father's point of view for the first time. You know, what's it like for Abraham to leave the father? And I was like, wait a minute, these are my children who we're going to talk about leaving. So this is, to me, I just will, as I hand it over to Johari, say the great thing about these stories, and the reason we're still talking about them today, is that they do reinvent themselves for fathers, sons, war, peace, pandemic that we haven't had in a century. And that's the power of them. Is there just enough empty space in the story that we can all insert ourselves? So the Jewish tradition has largely seen it as devotion. The Christian tradition has largely seen it as, well, God, you know, Abraham stopped short. but God sacrificing his son, and God didn't stop short of sacrificing Jesus. And that opened now up to the Islamic tradition, which had a different interpretation altogether.
Well, you know, as we look at this, I'm going to again take some license to recontextualize this story, but place us in the place of Hagar, the mother of Ismail, and Abraham. That Ibrahim in this life and journey never has Allah asked him to do anything that Allah hasn't come through for him with something fantastic. We have narratives where the narrative says that Ibrahim was placed in a fire because he didn't want to become an idolater. And Ibrahim goes into the furnace, and Allah makes the furnace cool for him and a place of refuge. So if you have that kind of relationship, the Quran refers to Ibrahim as Khalilullah, the friend of Allah. If you have that kind of relationship and God asks you to do something, you know that God has a magnificent outcome for you. You don't know what it is. Hagar is in the desert of Arabia, and Abraham leaves her with her infant, and she says, you know, why are you leaving us? She asks again, why are you leaving us? And then the third time she says, has God asked you to do this? And he says, yes. And she says, then we'll be fine, because God has never let us down. You can leave us. We'll be perfectly fine in the desert. There's no water. There's nothing. But I now have to look for, between Safa and Marwa, between those two hills, what is it that God has for us? Because God has something for us. If you are in that family, then the child, and for me, it is not as important whether it's Ismail or Ishaq or Isaac or Ismail. It doesn't matter to me. What matters is that you are the child of Hagar and Ibrahim. And you know in your development that the well of Zemzem came from the bottom of my feet. God is not gonna, I don't know what Allah has for me, but God has something for me. And so in this, it is a test to see, will you step out on faith, knowing that God has a tremendous outcome for me? And this is the lesson for all of us. If I have the diagnosis of cancer, so what is that? If I lost my job, if I'm separated from whatever my familiar is, that if I have that relationship with the Supreme, I know it looks real scary, but I know I'm not going to be left out there. And for me, that is the message, and less about. I think if I was in Ismail with Ibrahim, I would have no reservations. The Quranic and prophetic narrative says that when the father is asked by the son, so what's going on? What are you going to do? Then he asked, does God tell you to do what you're doing? He said, yeah, then go ahead. You'll find me to be obedient. Why? Because, if Warren Buffett came to me and said, I want you to take all of your assets, right? Everything that you have, right? And I want you to put it on a stock that's about to have an IPO, right? There's some people who might say, I'm not going to do that. For me, I'd be like, well, so far Warren Buffett hasn't been too far off the mark. If that's the case, I'll put everything I have and wait for the return. Now, how much more between Ibrahim and Allah can you get in terms of a guarantee on the return on your investment? Pardon the Warren Buffett owes me, by the way.
But it reminds me of that joke in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, where this thing went around social media of like, okay, guys, I have a warning for you. Turns out that money is a good way to transfer coronavirus. So as a service to you, I'm going to ask you, take all your money right now, put it in a bag, leave it on the front porch. I'm going to gather it and protect you and make sure you don't get COVID-19.
Oh gosh, boy, we can't get led astray. I want to bring us to what happens in the Muslim pilgrimage, though. Yes. At the end of this, Ibrahim does show that he can be relied upon, that he does trust in God. And he has been tempted along the way by the devil. What are you sacrificing your son? You know, what kind of a God is that? And so on and so forth. We're making up these words, but something along those lines is temptation. And in the Islamic tradition, pilgrims throw stones at pillars that represent the devil as a way to physically and psychologically, right, denounce temptation and denounce the inclination toward evil. So we have a clip from Sacred Journeys, Bruce, in which Johari describes the personal and the communal response to this activity, this particular event from the life of Ibrahim.
You perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, you give up your familiar. You give up your lifestyle, your diet, your clothing, lipstick. You give up the things that are part of you. 7 pebbles, 7 circuits around the Kaaba, 7 days in a week, 7 heavens. There's something about that 7, and there's something about repetition for people. Once it's become habit forming, then maybe when you go back, you'll be able to practice. People get worked up because the fervor, the feeling is there that I'm letting some of my baggage go. Satan, you broke up my family. Satan, you caused me to lose my job. Satan, my child. We're in a group therapy. We're all getting it out.
The throwing of the rocks, I almost didn't go because I really did not think of it as anything significant, almost even silly. But I went, and the first one I was throwing rocks as if I was throwing them at my own flaws. And the second one, I found myself asking for strength to overcome those. And then the last one, I found myself feeling so alive, so happy that God is stronger than any of those stupid things that we give into. So it was really enlivening for me.
The pilgrims that you're with, if you had to guess, what's the one thing they're taking home?
They're taking home that their life is in God's hands, but still do the best you can. It doesn't mean sit back and wait. Sometimes the hurdles along the way are what make the journey valuable.
What do you get by going on a journey like this that you don't get by staying home?
You have to leave home to see what is out there in the world. And in many of the countries from which these people come, there are wars going on. And yet here you see people who are working together to generate a community that crosses all kinds of boundaries.
And this leads next to there are 2 big festivals in the Muslim calendar. One is Eid al-Fitr at the end of the month of Ramadan, and then comes Eid al-Adha. And Imam, would you just share with us your wonderful interpretation, not speaking for all Muslims, but your wonderful and this is directly related to the story of Abraham, because when God stays his hand in the story and he does not sacrifice his son, God presents a sheep.
Take it away, Johari. You know, in America, we have a tradition that we call Thanksgiving, and I think many people have sort of around the world have in some ways, you know, they know that there's American Thanksgiving, and the natives and the pilgrims shared a meal together, and the pilgrims brought what they had, and which was almost nothing, and the native people brought what they had. If you think about Islam, and I think Bruce mentioned this in his journeys, 1.6, 1.7 billion people dispersed around the world as Muslims, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and North America. And on this day, and it's amazing, if we were to have had the traditional pilgrimage to Mecca, each person who's on Hajj, we're talking about 3 to 4, official, maybe another 1 or 2 million undocumented people on pilgrimage. Each one of them will sacrifice a ram. But because they're on the journey to Mecca, can't have 4 or 5 million people all slaughtering a lamb in the city. So it's done by proxy. And so on that day of sacrifice, Eid al-Adha, meat, protein, which by the way was a big deal in the developing world, still is, protein, distributed throughout the world as charity. Right now, Islamic centers, relief organizations are gathering money from people to send to Somalia, to send to Bosnia. By the way, today is the anniversary of Srebrenica. The sending around the world food, so that on that day, everyone can have a day of Thanksgiving globally. Not just a Thanksgiving in New York or in Chicago, but in Kuala Lumpur and in Dar es Salaam and in Dakar, Senegal, and everywhere that you find. And the tradition is, I will take a part of that ram and I eat that with my family. And I take a part of it and I give it to my neighbors, so that on that day, everyone can taste. We're all sacrificing something that we have to give it to our neighbor. I think it should be called the global Thanksgiving. And just a caveat, if you live, let's say you live in Nigeria, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim, they're going to share in that sacrifice. If you live in other parts of the world, it is a tradition to share that harvest with your neighbor. And so with all of the post 9/11 stress and trauma, for us to remember that outside of America, people of other faiths who have a relationship, even the Uyghurs in China, will be sharing part of their sacrifice with their neighbors who might be Buddhist or Hindu.
It's a good thing to think about. And so the Eid happens, when is it this year?
It is
Friday,
going to be
Saturday?
It will be there's always this issue around moon sighting, but the day of Arafat that Bruce talked about, and you showed so well in the documentary, the day of Arafat is the day where people leave the city of Mecca and go out into the desert. There are no hotels, there's no restaurants. It's just a barren plain, preserved in that way for the last 14 centuries. People gather and spend a day in worship, seeking forgiveness, all in one giant humanity. And in that last sermon, if I may, the prophet, peace be upon him, says, I don't think I'll make this journey again with you. I think I see the end of my life is coming. But let me remind you of a few things. And he says, first, beware of economic exploitation. The second is beware of your rights to preserve the rights of women. And then he talks about the principles of your faith. And then he says, beware of racism. And so in that journey on Arafah, where people are away from everything, that then they return to their regular lives after the reminder of these 4 things. So for me, I'm always moved. I'm like totally like spaced out now. I'm on Arafat. That is the 9th day of the lunar month. On the 10th day of the lunar month is the day when they leave that place after spending the night in Muzdalifah, and then come and enjoy the benefits of Eid, and they make their sacrifice and so on. That will be, for most of us, it will be Friday. it will be the 31st of July, I believe. If we're not evergreen, we're not evergreen on this show, so I could say what day it is, right?
So 2020, but the year is 2020.
And the year is 2020, just to keep it. But quite often, Muslims may differ around the world depending on the sighting of the moon. But because the Saudi government has said the pilgrims will be there on that day, the 9th day of Dhul Hijjah, then it means globally that if our pilgrimages are there on the 9th, then the majority of people will have their Eid celebration called in different languages, different things. I'm always reminded in Senegal and Gambia, they call it Tabaski. And so I'm always confused. Tabaski, what is, Eid al-Adha. The Feast of Sacrifice will be on Friday. It is considered a great blessing to have the confluence of the day of Eid and the day of Friday, the day of gathering, to be superimposed. So I don't know, but I wish everyone a happy Eid. And I encourage people, whatever your faith tradition is, find somebody who may or may not know what this day is, and share with them the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of that phenomenal family.
Thank you. Let's bring Bruce back on. We're at the top of the hour and we need to wrap up. It's gone by so very, very quickly. I'll have to watch reruns to get all of the juice out of our gathering, the three of us together. In the final clip, you both will have last words, but Bruce, what would be your last spontaneous words here with us?
Well, what struck me about the clip that you just showed from the documentary in Sacred Journeys that we all did together, beside Johari's wisdom and enthusiasm, was something that we don't talk about a lot, which was the fact that stoning of the devil was done in a multi-story parking lot that was constructed by the Saudi government. And the woman who said so beautifully, I didn't want to go, perhaps neglected to point out that it was, 2, 3 in the morning when the slot came. I think that's one of the reasons people have these emotional experiences, is because it's kind of the human deprivation. But I bring up that, not to rain on the parade, but to talk about the fact that the parade is different in every year and in every generation and in every time. And I think that one of the power of the story is that the story has survived, right? And I think that, you mentioned, Johari, that Arafat is an area that's open to everyone. Well, that's the same place as the Sermon on the Mount, and that's the same place of Sinai, and that's the same place of Nebo, that these are places that are unknown and therefore are everywhere. I think of one of the great breakthroughs of the Hebrew Bible is that it entered a world 3,000 years ago where there was gods of water and gods of mountains and gods of land and gods and trees, and said, no, God is invisible and God is universal. And that was the massive breakthrough, and indivisible and open to everybody. And that was one of the many signature breakthroughs of the Hebrew Bible. But then, of course, the Hebrew Bible then had Moses and the laws, and that was, sort of problematic to some people. So along came Christianity and said, you know what? You can have this story everywhere. You can embrace this story through the body of Christ. And that was very helpful, but there were challenges in Christianity, and along comes Islam and said, all you do is you can be anywhere and you can believe. But I think these different interpretations were capable of being imposed onto the story because the breakthrough moments are anywhere, they are everywhere, they are in particular in one time and place, and they are in every time and place. And so the way I think about this, and my final thought would be, since this is at heart faith conversation, and the mission of the Abraham path is at its heart a mission to bring people together by encountering this story, is that these problems are so important that we can't sit back and say, I hope they solve them over there, and I hope they figure it out over in that part of the world. These are so important that we all have to step up and say, I'm going to try to find a solution in my country and in my community and in my neighborhood and my heart. So to echo what Johari said, find somebody of a different tradition, reach out to them and say, let's have a conversation, because that's the only way we're going to get out of this, is by talking about it, is by coexistence, and coexistence depends on dialogue.
Well, I will say thank you for the shout out to the Abraham Path Initiative. Really appreciate that. We're a nonprofit, and a number of our donors are on this line watching, and we appreciate all of the generosity that comes. Your generous gift of time, Johari and Bruce. Thank you so very, very much.
You know, I mean, but I'm going to say in a very direct way. You put up the website posting. This is a time of great charity and a time of great tragedy. And people, if you want to do something with that energy that you have, go to their website and donate. Go to their website and become a follower on the path. And with that knowledge and experience, then you can share it with others in a very authentic way, because you're a part of it. And that would be my invitation to those who are listening. Don't just be a bystander. Join us on the path in whatever way you can.
And I'll just briefly echo that and say that I got a call from a friend of mine. It was around the time of walking the Bible in Abraham, let's just call it 20 years ago, that Bill Urey had this dream of creating this path. And I remember sitting with Bill. And for those of you who don't know Bill, besides being a great, generous man, he sort of participated in creating negotiation studies and building bridges in the 1970s. And he had this vision to bring it here. And I've been on this path since before it existed. I've known every executive director, and Josh Weiss, I think, is here, and now Anisa. So you guys are doing important work. It's more challenging than ever. It's more important than ever, but more challenging than ever. And so I'll echo Johari in saying, we need you on the path. We need your physical involvement. We need your financial involvement. We need your time involvement. So I will echo that I'm pleased to be part of this project and have been since its very inception.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning our founder. If you make a gift as a result of the pitches you've just heard from Johari and Bruce, we'll send you a copy of William Urey's Getting to Yes, which is that book on negotiation that really made a big transition in the appreciation of how we can work together. Thank you both so very much. I've really enjoyed this hour, and I know that our audience has too. Really appreciate your time and your service to humankind. And if you'll all stay for the next, there's just another minute-long clip that really ties this all together with comments from Johari and Bruce. I'm Anisa Mehdi for the Abraham Path Initiative. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Allah created human beings in the best mold. And when you see them on Hajj, they are, with all of their difficulties, on their best human behavior. If human beings, year after year, decade after decade, millennia after millennia, can do that, then it means there is hope for humanity.
And perhaps that hope is the true destination of the Hajj, along with the realization that it can only be achieved with the cooperation of others. It's the ultimate lesson of the sacred journey. The road is tough. You can't survive alone. The only way to get through is to open yourself up to the suffering and the support of those around you. And maybe that's the point all along.